Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Jenny Tutone, the Interim Executive Director at the Natural History Institute. And before I introduce tonight's speaker, I have a couple quick announcements. First off, the restrooms and water fountains are just on the other side of that wall, but you need to go through this hallway and keep turning right to access them. And then please leave all questions until the end. We'll have time for Q&A afterward. And then please silence your cell phones. We're so glad to have you here tonight. Our speaker series is just one of the many ways we bring people together to explore, celebrate, and connect with the natural world. And I wanted to share a few of our upcoming events. This Saturday, September 20th, we'll celebrate the autumn equinox with an open house. We'll have nature art printing, seasonal drinks from Superstition Meadery, and a chance to explore our scientific collections. And on Saturday, September 27th, artist Daniel Mayer will lead a workshop on landscape accordion books, where you can create your own handmade books from recycled maps. And then on Thursday, October 2nd, you can dive into the flora of the Mogollon Highlands with a presentation by me at Yavapai College at Ollie. And then later that evening, right here at NHI, Dr. Robert Johnson will share about the ants of Arizona. And lastly, on October 4th, join us along the Upper Verde River for a mindful meandering, a full day slowing down and connecting deeply with nature. So we have a lot of great upcoming programs. Be sure you're on that email list or check out our website. And programs like these and tonight's talk are possible thanks to community support. If you're inspired, please consider making a gift or becoming a monthly sustainer. Every contribution helps sustain this work. You can come see me or Abigail after the talk. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, back by popular demand, Michael Kellett. Michael Kellett has a total of 25 years of experience working with the BLM and Forest Service, including 3 years supervising heritage program on the Prescott National Forest. He completed his MA in Anthropology in 2020 and has over 5 years of experience as a professional archaeologist. His experience has included inventory and recording of cultural and historic resources in Arizona, Nevada, California, Utah, New Mexico, and Oregon. In addition to these experiences, Kellett holds a red card as a fire archaeologist, fire line resource advisor, and burned area emergency response specialist, and has served in these capacities on dozens of wildland fire incidents throughout the Western U.S. for 22 years. So with that, please give a warm welcome to Michael Kellett with his talk, Inscribed Landscapes, Petroglyphs and Pictographs of Western Central Arizona.
Good evening, and thank you for joining me. Is the sound pretty good for folks that can hear me okay? I'm getting thumbs ups, that's great. So I came to archaeology kind of late in life. I didn't go to grad school until after I retired. I was a fisheries biologist for most of my career with the BLM and Forest Service. But after moving here in 2015, I started exploring, the neighborhood and finding numerous cultural sites. And the more I found and the more I read, the more interesting it was. And I decided this is what I want to do after I retire. So that's what I did. So tonight's discussion is going to talk about processes for creating pictographs and petroglyphs and a diversity of elements that we see in the local archaeology. All of the photos you'll be seeing are Yavapai County, so they're relatively local. Talk a little bit about panel composition. Now, when we have a group of elements or a single element on a singular rock face, that's subdivided into what we call panels. So groups of elements form a panel. And how the elements are arranged on a panel can tell part of the story. Also landscape context. Why did the indigenous people choose to put their petroglyphs here versus somewhere else? How were those sites selected, and why is that meaningful? How can that inform the interpretation? Also, how archaeologists record these resources. There are some techniques I will illustrate to you, and some technology tools that we use that are relatively new. Always with the inferences toward interpretation, and I couch that carefully because this really requires an indigenous perspective. We can gain quite a bit from ethnographic records or indigenous informants, but apart from that, we have a hard time understanding their culture. So we'll do the best that I've been able to do so far tonight. If there are questions, I encourage you to ask if I don't clarify something. So archaeologists like to, when we're recording these resources, we like to categorize and group things to help us make sense of them. So I'm going to talk about 3 kinds of elements at the beginning, just to kind of dip the toe in the pool. First are anthropomorphic elements. These are images of humans, very often doing things or with certain attire that it might be telling or informative about the meaning of the panel. So on the left there, I would really like to have met this person because I'm thinking he had moves. That is as animated as you can get on a rock, right? And that hair, what's going on with the hair? Questions, right? So it's more than just a person standing there. There's animation. There's something with the headdress that's interesting. Next to them, there's another one. These are what we'd call stick figure anthropomorphs, right? And then on the right, we see some filled in or fully pecked anthropomorphs. And in the middle there, we have a set of stylized anthropomorphs that look like they're joined in a line. We'll talk a little bit more about what that might mean later. And included in anthropomorphic elements would be feet and handprints. Now, how were these petroglyphs in this case made? 2 ways pretty much. You got direct percussion, that is you take a pointed hammerstone and you pick away the patina that's on the outer surface of the rock, and it reveals the lighter rock underneath the patina. And the other method, which allows for much greater fine control, is the indirect percussion, where the artist would take a pebble or a chisel, like a piece of stone, and strike it with a hammerstone. So that way you can control better the image that is produced. These are zoomorphic elements I'm showing you now. Zoomorph is any living creature, non-human. So it could include insects as well. Also birds, mammals, and reptiles, very commonly represented here. And I want to focus your attention on one in the corner, right here. Ideas? It's a mountain lion. The artist chose to emphasize the teeth and the claws and the tail, which, if you've seen a mountain lion, they're very distinctive. You know when you see that tail exactly what just crossed the path there. Your artiodactyls, deer, and bighorn sheep, very common elements in this area. Reptiles like snakes and lizards, also very, very common in this area. So if they're not anthropomorphs and they're not zoomorphs, they're probably just geometric elements. This is a very broad category. It can include either outlined or fully pecked shapes, as well as scrolls and whorls and spirals and frets. We have concentric circles illustrated. That's not going to work. Concentric circles right here. We have what are called, back up, textile patterns, or sometimes mazes here. I think that pretty well just a general overview of geometric elements. So this is not a petroglyph, this is a pictograph. The difference is, rather than pecking the rock, the artist used a mineral pigment, which was ground and then mixed with animal fat or vegetable oil to produce a paint. And then the paint is applied with a brush or a finger, mostly. There are also some charcoal ones I'll show you that are just drawn with a piece of charcoal, like a charcoal sketch. I'm going to embed quotes or excerpts from citations throughout this. Some of them will disappear, and some of them will stay on for the whole slide. But I think they inform the discussion, so while I'm yammering on up here, I encourage you to read those and try to digest some of what's being imparted. Now, in itself, this is a fairly unremarkable panel to the naked eye. I can tell you that there are some kaolin elements right here. That is what's called a palulicon. It's a plumed serpent. We'll go into more of the origins of that, the Mesoamerican origins of that a little later. And we have another shape there that we can make out, and maybe you can kind of see some faint yellow or reddish markings there. So when we're confronted with a situation like this, I like to use software called D-Stretch. D-Stretch enhances certain spectra within the image, and so we can see that on that same panel, this is not a sleight of hand or anything, it's enhanced the limonite pictographs, which were nearly invisible to the naked eye. They have faded over time. This panel does have some sun exposure, and the paint isn't permanent, of course. It will weather off. This site does have what's called a roof over it, so it has rain protection, but not from the wind or blowing dust or sun. And so what we have here now that I want to focus your attention on is these two lines of people carrying logs over their heads. I was stunned when I processed this image and saw that, because there's a researcher named Field that published a chapter in Sacred Southwest Landscapes, and he describes timber pilgrimages to Chaco. Now, the timber pilgrimage was instituted, I think, based on the research that he shared, based on the origin stories of the Zuni, which include emergence through 4 worlds using 4 different tree species. So in their sacred architecture, like at Chaco, the kivas and great kivas, they would use timbers representing each of those 4 species in the frame, the roof frame. So they had to haul this stuff sometimes over 100 kilometers, because one of those species is a high altitude spruce. But that's part of the origin story. So it needed to be in the roof of the kiva, the sacred architecture, because that origin story would be told and retold, and they could reference the members of the kiva itself as they're telling the story. Now, there are some other elements here we won't dwell on, but there's some conspicuously masculine elements here and here. So from that, I would derive that fertility had something, or virility, or both, had something to do with the ceremony that was remembered here. You know how artists today sign their work? They didn't do it that way then. They did it this way. That's a negative handprint. I'll bet you think spray paint was invented in the 20th century, didn't you? No. This artist loaded a cane, a hollow reed, with kaolin pigment, put his hand on the wall, and spray painted it, and took the hand away, and you have the handprint. Now, what does the handprint signify? Not always the maker or the artist, but it more likely signifies a participant in the ceremony or someone who completed a pilgrimage to this site, left their mark. Many of these ceremonies or rituals involve rites of passage. They were becoming a citizen in their culture, a member of a society. So there was an ordeal. They would go through an initiation, and very often upon completion, they would make their mark. This is a similar example of a pictograph, but in this case, the artist used an iron oxide pigment, hematite, and painted a design on the palms, right and left, and transferred it to the wall. It's a personal touch, isn't it? It's like finding fingerprints in the plaster wall in a pueblo. It's very personal. So same site, different panel. This one mostly kaolin. That's an enhanced image on the right. The same panel you see on the left. So the enhancement brings out more elements that are conspicuous with the naked eye, and it enhances them. So what I see here that drew my eye to this initially was these 5 anthropomorphic figures with backpacks and walking sticks. This is a pilgrimage. This is a journey. And who are those people? Well, most likely, the other thing you see here are outlined cross symbols. I see 4 of them, and then a dotted cross symbol. Those are the clan symbol of the Sand Clan. So we know something about the who and something about the what. Now the where. What does that look like to you? A river, or maybe a canyon. Maybe the Grand Canyon. The Hopi have a salt pilgrimage that goes to the Grand Canyon. They have a different salt pilgrimage that comes to the Verde Valley. We'll talk about that a little later. But this was the one to the Grand Canyon, I think. That's consumable salt. The one here was for ceremonial salt. The salt in the salt mine is blue. It's not sodium chloride. Oh, let me back up just a second. We also see in this some textile patterns. Those could also be identifiers because the textile manufacture done by the men primarily, often in the kiva, would signify the group responsible for that garment. The patterns are very telling. I'm not a textile specialist in archaeology, but I know enough from reading and looking at the examples at the Verde Valley Archaeological Center, for example, that they're very unique and distinctive, these patterns. So the panel on the right is at the Crane Petroglyph site, which is available for the public to come and see, and there are docents there to interpret it. But what I wanted to talk about just for briefly is clan symbols. We've already seen one from the Sand Clan. We have a couple more examples here. We have cranes. I see 1, 2, 3, 4 probably cranes. That's the Crane clan. So the Crane Petroglyph site is also a pilgrimage destination. And we'll get into why a little bit later. But this panel seems to record at least one clan's journey to visit this site. And on the left, we have a very distinct bear print. That's the Bear Clan. A different site, of course. So clan symbols tend to indicate participation in an event, a ceremony, a ritual, a visitation by a specific group. And all of those groups, if you study Hopi ethnography, each clan has certain ceremonial duties, responsibilities, and in total, they see that as maintaining the world order, not just for them, all humanity. So they all have different roles, and all of their ceremonies are distinctive, but there is some overlap in the ceremonial items sometimes, or the applications, like we'll talk about with timing, ceremonial timing. So calendrical functions we'll get into. So we've seen this once before. What does that look like? It looks like Sand Clan symbol, doesn't it? In this case, it may also be, it may represent Venus. This is another very Mesoamerican idea. Quetzalcoatl, who is a Maya deity, is represented by both the morning and the evening star, which are both Venus, we know now. But there was an event in Quetzalcoatl's life, of course, where he died. He went to the afterlife and was reborn, and thus the two representations. And that has sort of mutated in indigenous lore into hero twins. But the idea and the Mesoamerican influence is clear. And I know that sounds far-fetched, that people in Central America were bringing ideas here or vice versa. People from here were going down to get stuff and ideas from Mesoamerica. But we know that was the case because in excavation context here, we find scarlet macaws periodically that were alive when they brought them here. And cocoa residues on certain special vessels. Cocoa won't grow here. They had to be getting it from down there. So ideas and technologies and commodities, these are things, and DNA, these are things people move around and have throughout history. These linear abrasions that you see here probably also reflect a ceremonial practice. I'll talk more about it in the next slide. These are called cupules. One of the gentlemen in attendance tonight, Matt, introduced me to the site on the right, NA 28994. Those are Museum of Northern Arizona numbers, if you see an NA. So these cupules, what is going on here? They're just clusters of little pockets ground into the rock. Well, there's a process called geophagy, wherein in certain times, in certain cultures, women ingested soil, or in this case, rock flour, to enhance fertility, conception. It was a common practice. The other use that has been suggested and documented in some cases for cupules is by healers, medicine men, because once these sites are inscribed, they're empowered. And if you can take a piece of that home to cure, to heal, then that's what's required. That rock flour becomes medicine. So this implies that these are both empowered sites, and that they were used repeatedly over time for probably one of those two purposes. I wanted to talk a little bit about chronology, because in the panels shown here and the enhanced version, de-stretched version on the right, they are the same panel. We see some very different looking elements. The lines, the parallel wavy lines there, those probably implied dancers. We'll see that later in this presentation. And we see some figures, especially here in kaolin, that don't have any legs. They're anthropomorphic, but no legs. Probably spirit. No need of legs. And then at the bottom, what I really wanted to focus our attention on is the mounted rider. When did we get horses around here? After 1540, the Spaniards brought them. And as far as we can tell, in all of the research that's been done, the Sinagua did not have access to horses. So, in all probability, what we have here is an Apache rendering in charcoal, direct transfer, not a paint, long after the initial composition. So it's superimposed on this panel. Here's a better example, also Apache, same site. And in this case, they've emphasized eagle feathers, an eagle feather headdress, black-tipped charcoal tips with kaolin feathers, shafts. And he's also a rider on a horse. What's exaggerated here? The left hand. What's significant about the left hand? The left hand is sacred. The right hand feeds the mouth and is profane. But for placing prayer sticks, offering cornmeal, other ceremonial functions, the left hand is used. So this is definitely a powerful person, a powerful image, and a great story. I wish I knew more about it. Also notice he's not holding the reins. Both hands are out in space out here. He's not holding the reins, and he has no legs. This isn't human. This is spirit. These are also later renderings. They're Yavapai. Those emanations that you can see distinctly here especially are power lines. So these are also spirit creatures that you see here. Non-human, but anthropomorphic. This one is familiar to me from other renderings at this site. This is Skadakamsha, who is a deity, a Yavapai deity, a hero, always portrayed with the half diamonds on the torso and the feathered headdress. This is the Crane Heritage Site again, and I wanted to talk a little bit about Ken Zoll's work. He recorded this site for a year with other volunteers in the Verde Valley Archaeological Center. If you look closely at this area of the petroglyph, we will see several concentric circles with umbilicated centers. Those represent the sun. Here on top are some horned lizards. That is the water clan sign, and given their prominent position on the panel, we can make an inference because we know ethnographically that the sun priest came from the water clan. This is a sun watcher panel. There are shade stones in this cleft up here. And over the course of the year, between the vernal equinox and the summer solstice, a pattern of light and shadow moves across this panel in a counterclockwise fashion at midday. This is read at midday. And there are 3 separate sets of corn plants. They look like centipedes, probably, to you. Can you see them? Those are times to plant corn. You have an early, a middle, and a late planting. Now, the early planting is important because the early corn is for the home dance. That's an offering at the home dance. And what they're doing here, really, it's a calendar, but it informs their ceremonial function and their growing season, which are integrated. They're not separate things. They didn't stovepipe or silo their lives the way we do today. They're one and the same. And then down here, I did it again. We have the dancing figures. You see the parallel wavy line down there? That is the home dance. So it had a time. It was after the last planting. What happens at the home dance? We send the kachina, or the mountain spirits, back to where they live. So we invited them at the winter solstice. We start planting after the vernal equinox, in April actually, about the 21st, is when the first corn stalk lights up. And then so we're bracketing the monsoons. This is genius. They're bracketing the monsoons. You don't know in any given year they're going to come late, they're going to come early. You're probably going to hit 2 out of 3. Remember, they had to preserve this seed corn over the winter and have enough for 3 plantings. So there's an example, wrong time of year. I shot this in early March. But you can see one of the shade stones in action there, casting a shadow. Now, in full effect, after the vernal equinox, you will see 2 shadows, because there are 2 shade stones, and they will bracket a sunbeam, and that's how this was read. So we talked about in our anthropomorphic element discussion, rows of people. They signify dance. Much of the ceremonial life of indigenous people, pre-contact indigenous people included, revolved around ceremonies and dance and song. So in the rendering on the right, I do with Adobe Illustrator, and I use the paintbrush tool and just dot it instead of making streaks. So it represents the pecking, and it helps me to classify and interpret panels a lot better sometimes than just the picture itself, which can be confusing sometimes. So we also see on this panel a serpent, very, very clear serpent. I don't know if that's a plume serpent or a rattlesnake. Something's going on with that tail. Could be a rattlesnake. And then we have a snake handler here. You see him? He's handling snakes. When do the Hopi handle snakes? I keep referencing the Hopi. I should clarify that. Most likely descendant community of the Sinagua and many of the Puebloan groups that occupied this area. So the snake dance, the Hopi do the snake dance. That is essentially a prayer for rain. It's a good way to think about these petroglyph panels and pictograph panels is as prayers. As we'll see later, it touched on almost every aspect of their lives. They're reflected in these petroglyphs. We have some more dancers there, and we now recognize what that concentric circle, umbilicated concentric circle, represents the sun, right? So we're dancing, and the sun's off on the right. So the indigenous people, including the Hopi, they had a dance they called the Soyao. They do it at the winter solstice. And that's to welcome the sun from his winter home to the summer home. Days are going to start getting longer now, right? So instead of treating that as a given, as an assumed, what if you needed to influence that? Beckon the sun into the summer house so the days get longer so you can grow your food. That's exactly what's going on here. This is a kind of a prayer again. Gender is often revealed. We saw it in one of the earlier panels with masculine gender. Now we have examples of the feminine gender. The two figures on the right in this enhanced version, those are hair whorls or butterfly whorls. They're worn by maidens. And they are dancing. And they're holding staffs. I don't know what that dance is about, but this fella is not a woman. But he gets to dance with two of them. So good for him. So we have another example of femininity in a very atypical role here. This, I believe, portrays a healing ceremony. We have a recumbent individual, probably the sick, and we have a healer standing over them with an arm raised, and we have moon elements here below them and here off to the right. Healing ceremony very often overnight with the full moon. The full moon elicits that healing, that wholeness, that refreshing, if you will. And that's what I think we're seeing here, and the only one I've ever seen where the definitely female performing that ritual. One more example of one more slide with examples of femininity. This is an unusual example on the left. Not only do we see the hair whorls, but we see breasts indicated below the armpits by those diagonal lines. And I'm not sure what she's doing, but she's surrounded by zoomorphs, bighorn sheep, mostly. I think it's also shamanistic. Can't be totally positive of that. On the right, we see the flute player. Now, the flute player is kind of like the Pied Piper of plant germination. That's one role. So this is a recumbent flute player, which is especially associated with that. But not always. It can also be rainmaking, or, and I think in this case is illustrated by the maiden standing beside him. This is about courtship. Indigenous peoples, during courtship, it was a very public process. And they would woo the object of their affection with flute music. And in some cases, having won the prize, destroy the flute, as if to say, I've made my choice. No more courts for anybody. But it was the woman who decided when enough was enough. True. So we've talked a little bit about shamanism. Shamanism, a holy man, a medicine man or woman, a healer, a person of power and great respect in these societies. Most often portrayed with enlarged or exaggerated hands and feet. Those are power centers. If you think about just a healing, a shaman who is a healer, that healing is often affected by touch. Sometimes some rock flour helps too, but some touch, right? So that power is transmitted through the hands in that case. In another case I'll show you later is through the feet. So enlarged feet and hands often usually signify a shaman. Now, once inscribed, again, these panels are empowered. These reflect the shaman's dreams or visions. How those dreams and visions were enhanced or elicited, we'll talk a little bit about in a few minutes. Here's our enlarged left foot. That anthropomorphic figure with the unusual ear attachments, and this one, both have exaggerated left feet. This is a kind of healing ceremony we would call an exorcism, affected by removing the shoes from the left foot of the shaman to connect with that energy and dispel that evil. I think this is the last shamanistic interpretation I'm going to offer tonight, and this is bizarre. We have a hematite image. This is unenhanced, and this is enhanced. I want to focus your attention on the cuffs, on the forelegs and hind legs, and what's going on with these toes and fingers. They're humanistic, aren't they? I think what you have here is a skinwalker. So shaman, in their visions, they enlist the support of a spirit helper. They actually become the lizard or the animal or the bird in many cases. And I think that's what's portrayed here is a vision quest, where with the support or help of this spirit helper, the shaman is becoming, he's transitioning to the other side to get his wisdom and bring it back. I mostly included this site, this site to illustrate to you again how you can enhance some of these with a rendering. So these are done in Adobe Illustrator by bringing in the photo as a backdrop, doing the drawing, and then taking the photo away. So you end up with a rendering. One more thing I want to point out here is this barbell-like element is it incorporates an older petroglyph. The concentric circles in the open end at top are older. They're repatinated. So in between when they're originally made, or after they were originally made, some time after, the later petroglyph was applied around it. Now there is some research by Patterson that it used a Ute informant, and they found that symbols like that one, the barbell shapes, connected by a line, were hunting maps. They overlaid a bunch of these on topographic maps, and you have to scale it right and everything. But the Ute informant was talking about how the open end would be like an encounter where you predictably find the game, and then you would drive them on this line, and you could ambush them at the other circle, is how those worked. I haven't done the homework with this one. It is located adjacent to a spring, which would make a pretty good ambush site. The water source. So the other symbols we see here, there's a couple of serpents. Snakes, very important, and again, related to rain or water. The most very fluvial form, body shape of a snake, and some solar symbols, and on the lower end of the panel, some zoomorphs. Can't tell you much beyond that. This one was a very, very early recording that I had to relocate. And that's a chore because this is like before GPS, back in the 50s. So a dot on a map where he thought he was. And Euler was one of the folks that actually recorded this. So it's that old. So today, if you want to go hunting, you go buy a license, and you either own a gun or you procure one and some ammunition, and you go hunting. And your success is determined by your luck or your skill or some combination of the two. Not so with the indigenous people, especially not pre-contact indigenous people. These panels reflect what's called hunt magic. A prayer, a form of prayer for success in the hunt. This was not a hunting story. This was an incantation. This is before the hunt ever happened. There's a right way to do things. There's a song that went with this hunt. There's a dance that went with this hunt. There's ceremonial preparation, purification, and not just any man in the society went hunting. There were a select few, good ethnographic evidence from the descendant community of the Hohokam, the Odom people, where only in a village, maybe only 4 or 5 of the men could actually participate in the hunts. The other men had other stuff they could do, but not that. So there's a sacred aspect to this as well. Bighorn sheep, one of the most common zoomorphs in this area and very common out on the Agua Fria Monument. We don't have bighorn sheep there now. Why? Yeah, it's not the highways. It's a good guess, but not the highways. In the late 19th century, Euro-American, let's call them Eurotrash, they brought domestic livestock, sheep and goats, including sheep and goats. They carry respiratory diseases that the bighorn sheep have no resistance. Mycoplasma pneumonia, lungworm, and some viral respiratory infections that our bighorn sheep had no resistance. So the population's been drastically reduced from what it was. But bighorn sheep aren't just common petroglyph elements because they're meat. They're sacred animals. Very often you'll see headdresses in ceremonies that include sheep horns on the headdresses. At the fairground site here in Prescott, they unearthed 2 bighorn sheep statues, carved stone statues that are pre-contact, 800-900 years old. And they're on exhibit at the Museum of Indigenous People if you'd like to see those. Down in excavated contexts in the Phoenix Basin, Hohokam contexts, they have found entire piles of cremated bighorn sheep horns. Well, what was going on there? They're associated with rain and the wind that brings the rain. You've ever noticed on our monsoons the wind comes with the rain? They noticed that too. And so they're eliciting both with these sheep hunts. And then the shaman who would use the help of the sheep, the spirit, to gain the favor to bring the wind and the rain. Now, there are some idiosyncrasies with element placement that we probably ought to talk about. On the left here, that vesicle in the basalt didn't form after the petroglyph was put there. So the artist deliberately put the petroglyph so that the vesicle represented the anus of this bighorn sheep. You think, how peculiar. And then I was reading some literature that Scott did right up here in Groom Creek. There's a site that had hundreds of zoomorph ceramic effigies, fired ceramic effigies of animals and some people, but mostly the animals I'm talking about. And most of them have deliberately created holes where the rectum should be. So there's something to this. I don't completely get it, but it's fascinating to me. I'd like to know more. The panel on the right is showing one used for the mouth instead. So equal opportunity here. This vesicle was used to represent the sun. Now, you remember the other sun element we saw was concentric circles with an umbilicated center. I haven't told you about the umbilicated center. Father, Son gives gifts from his belly button. That's what this belief is centered about. So they've represented the sun here with a very large umbilicus, a very generous sun. It's a prayer. It's a petition. This site's on the upper Verde River, the very, very upper end of the Verde River, where a spring erupts in the channel bottom and forms most of the base flow of the Verde River. And I believe what the artist did here was he represented that spring with this elongate vesicle and then the swirling currents around it. So groundwater, very, very important and sacred. Water from below, from the underworld, emerging into this world is a gift, and it's being celebrated here. The other element that I wanted to point out is the hummingbird. So birds of all types are a conduit for prayers. That's why prayer sticks have bird feathers attached to carry the prayer skyward. And in this case, they've placed the hummingbird element above the spring. It's a prayer for water. The hummingbird is carrying the prayer. This vesicle, this element is a typical spiral, which usually interpreted as a journey. Could be a pilgrimage or any other journey. This particular one is, I believe, about what the Hopi call finding the center, or the center place. So every clan has a story that they tell and retell, and it's told in the order in which their ceremony was performed and where. So it's a travelogue of sorts over time, long lengths of time. And the other thing you need to know about Hopi origin stories is they came into this world from under the underworld through a sipapu, a hole in the ground. And in their sacred architecture, they put a hole in the floor to represent their place of emergence, which is really close to the Grand Canyon in reality. But that's, I think, what this vesicle represents here is the place of emergence, and then the wanderings to find the center, which of course is the Hopi Mesas, their center place. So I came across this panel just a few days after the winter solstice. And at first I was peeved that the sun was doing that to this beautiful panel. And then I looked at the pictures and I said, no, you dummy. That's telling you this is the time to read that panel. Look at the zoomorphs walking on the line between light and shade, light and shadow. And they're walking toward the one-horned priest, the guy on the end with the feather over his head. So this is meant to be read at the solstice. If you look at the image on the lower right, that's later. And you can't make any sense of how those elements are arranged, or I can't. I shouldn't infer that on you. So in the upper right of that panel, there's this character here. This is an enhanced version of this. He has no legs, and he's holding a datura pod, or it's hovering over his hand. Anybody know what datura is? A Jimson weed? It's hallucinogenic. It's very powerful hallucinogenic. And shaman, and among other ways, would induce their visions by ingesting datura. So this is part of someone's vision we're seeing here. And he's telling you how he got there. This is a busy panel, and we're not going to go into it in great detail, but I wanted to highlight this element right here, which is enlarged for you to see it here. That's a dragonfly. Dragonfly is a sacred shamanistic creature, and it has a lot to do with renewing springs. As you know, dragonflies have aquatic larvae. They're predaceous. They live in the water. It takes them a long time to mature. And then they emerge as winged creatures. The indigenous people knew that too. They came from the water. And you knew there's water nearby if you saw dragonflies, for sure. So they associate them with springs, and specifically the renewal of springs. And that's what I think that element here means. They're celebrating or asking for a renewal of springs. The rest of them I'm struggling with. Now, there was a supernova in 1054 AD. It's recorded all over the world. It resulted in what we have now as the Crab Nebula. I don't know if any of you have seen that through a telescope, but you can still see it. So that was a violent explosion in space, and it produced a star, a Big Bang, if you will, a star that was visible in the day, even next to the sun, for quite a few weeks. Yeah, the Chinese recorded this, among other people. Now, Weaver has determined that there are several panels on the Colorado Plateau that also record this supernova. This panel that I'm showing you here, and enhanced here, is another panel on the Agua Fria Monument that DeLange and DeLange say is that same supernova. Actually got it down on rock before the Chinese recorded it, he says, or they say. So the other elements here, again, we had the hollow circle representing the moon in an earlier panel. That's represented here. So this is a nighttime view, and you have the horizon represented as a big circle around the whole sky. Mountains on one side, hills on the other. And I won't go into why they think that's the Pleiades and why they think that's Orion on top. I think that's beyond my scope. But that's what they determined this looked like. Be careful who you believe on that kind of stuff, though. So sometimes, certain contexts, I find groundstone, and even communal groundstone in this case, with petroglyphs. So out of curiosity, I had to know more, like what is going on here? So what do we know about grinding in this time period? We know women did it. We know that from osteological evidence, repeat stress injuries on hands, elbows, wrists, and sometimes shoulders from a lifetime of grinding food. So what other functions do you suppose women were doing at least part of the time? Early child care, every culture. Early child care is women's job. So if you have to grind your food every day for your family, and you have to watch your kids, might you also indoctrinate your kids into who they are? Their origin stories, where they came from, where their people have been. So you see the journey spirals in both cases. The journey spirals, you see one over here, and you see one right here. Among the groundstone. I think that's what's going on in this case, is they're teaching their kids while they're grinding their food. Now sometimes, these are other fine examples of that. This one is very difficult to see. It's right there. See it? Okay, we'll move on. So sometimes it's not communal groundstone, it's singular metate with petroglyphs. And I'm forming the opinion or the hypothesis now that these are probably ceremonial grinding. Many of these ceremonies involved meal offerings, cornmeal offerings specifically. So I don't know that they had to process them right there where the ceremony took place, but I'm guessing that was probably part of the deal. What these particular glyphs represent, I'm not totally sure, but they are in context with groundstone, and that's what I've come up with. Petroglyphs notoriously difficult to date. There aren't any good processes really for figuring out how old they are. But by inference, if they have textile patterns, or in this case ceramic patterns, we can infer that they were roughly contemporary. Now, that sherd on the right is from a collection at the Museum of Indigenous People. And it's flagstaff black on white. So Tucson whiteware, flagstaff black on white. And those are barbed lines. And they're bordered by other barbed lines. And that panel right there has the same pattern. There's the drawing of it. See it? So sometime between about 1100 AD or shortly after 1100 AD to almost 1200 AD, that petroglyph was probably made. That's when they were manufacturing flagstaff black on white. I said that many of the ceremonies these people did involved dance and song. How would you represent song in a petroglyph? I think I found the answer. I think this person is singing his song. Now, these are not songs like we learned in grade school. These songs are very personal. The songs are given to them by the spirits, and they weren't rehearsed by a crowd of people or anything. They were solo. And every person's song was unique. And there are 6 of these elements in this panel, this sky panel that we're looking at right here. And they all have those word bubbles, for lack of a better term, from their heads. Initially, when I found this, I thought, that's got to be an encouragement to look in a certain direction. So I was lining up on them and looking, no, that's not it. So more thinking, more reading, more research. I think I'm pretty happy with the song hypothesis on that. So we talked about Mesoamerican influences, and we talked about the representation of Venus. This is another representation of Venus, which is Mesoamerican. It's the hollow cross. Again, represented in duplicate for the morning and evening star, I think. And this person appears to be contemplating the heavens. Look at him under the canopy of the sky there. So NA 9873 is in Brooklyn Basin. I made a video with the Institute here not too long ago, which should hit the street in a little while. And it's about this site. So there are 2 points of entry to a set of dozens of panels along a rim rock. 2 points of entry. This panel marks one of those entries. And you can see 2 lizards connected by a squiggly line at the tails. You see that? I believe this set of panels was a kind of journey where you would enter in one place, probably here, and go to the exit on the other end, because there's no petroglyphs beyond the exit. There's no petroglyphs beyond the entrance either. So they're all in between. So lizards, they're liminal creatures. That comes from thought philosopher, anthropology philosopher named Van Gennep in the very early 20th century, first decade, wrote a book called Rites of Passage, where he noted in all world cultures, there are what he defined as rites of passage, things to do with coming of age, or childbirth, or marriage, or death, going to war, making peace, all rites of passage where there was a process that you had to go through from beginning to end to enter that next phase, that next stage of life. And in between, you were kind of in limbo. That's the liminal phase, he called it. So I called lizards liminal creatures because what do they do in life? What's their behavior? They move in and out of cracks in the rocks. They're microhabitats, right? Well, the indigenous people saw that as a conduit to the underworld. So these lizards, and snakes for that matter, are liminal in that they transcend that boundary to the other world. And the shaman would enlist their support or their help, the spirit help, to do the same in their visions. So you think Bragan's story, this guy bagged a big one? You see the antlers on this? And this? You see right where my arrow inside the light is? That's a deer body attached to this. Okay? Well, these indigenous people had a notion they called the sacred tree. Kind of like the Zuni origin story I told you about, where they climbed into this world on different tree species, right? Well, this sacred tree allows movement between worlds. The Maya had a similar idea. I have a Maya drawing that has the whole tree, including the roots underground, because you can see the connection with the underworld, the surface, and the sky, right? This is a similar idea, only I think it's mostly referring to the sky world. The sacred tree, there's good evidence, ethnographic evidence, that the deer antlers are associated with rain. You'll notice that's a repeating theme, right? Rain. They were farmers. We're dependent on the monsoonal rains to come at the right time and the right quantity for them to survive here. So rain is a big deal. And I'm thinking they enlisted a lot of help from a lot of different sources. We have more examples of the same thing. This is almost ridiculous. Look at this. That's literally a tree growing out of his head. So I think the idea behind this is centered around that sacred tree notion, with transcending that boundary to the sky. So I told you earlier about relocating sites, old recorded sites. This one was recorded in the 70s, and this was very difficult to relocate. It happens to be right next to the salt mine road. I didn't know that when I set out looking for it. But it's now 1/3 to 1/2 buried in road fill. And it's a very important panel because I had the privilege of, well, I'll show you first. This is how I identified it as the same one as the recording. You see this drawing? It spirals, and then this hook up here. There's the hook, there's the spiral, there's the second spiral. So I said, okay, this is it. So if you go to the north panel, which is this one, I had the privilege of visiting this site with Hopi elders, 5 of them. And this counter-rotating spiral right there is right here. So you can see how much of this panel's buried. All these elements are underground here now. But this wasn't buried when I was there with the Hopi elders, so this has happened in the last 5 years. The road crew buried it. They tell me that that spiral is the pilgrimage from the Hopi Mesas to the salt mine in Camp Verde and the copper pit in Jerome, where they were getting malachite. It's a pigment they use ceremonially. So that's why the line forks. There it is. Forks at the end. One's the salt mine, one's Jerome. And then it's a return because it's a round trip pilgrimage, right? And there is actually archaeological evidence that that's a real thing, not just a historic thing. That's a pre-contact thing because the people that made that pilgrimage prehistorically left things. When they showed up to harvest something, like salt in this case, they didn't just show up, start digging, and leave. They left offerings. And these were tunnels in this salt mine. It's now all stripped out because historically it was mined by a pharmaceutical company too. And it ruined all the tunnels, but the artifacts were unearthed in the process, and now mostly at the Arizona State Museum, but mostly the offerings are sandals. They left their shoes. Woven sandals, lots of them, and rock picks made from rock that they would harvest the salt with. So this petroglyph panel is very unique, and I try not to throw you too many unique things because there's marginal information value there if it's a one-off. But this one, I'm pretty convinced it has to do with a snake dance because before they do it, they have to round up the snakes. And they do, and they bathe them and they keep them in jars so they can bring them out and do the dance, and then they release them, right? So maybe this place where this petroglyph is hibernacula, like a good place to round up snakes, or maybe it was a place where the snake clan came together to do this thing. But I think probably one of the two, or both. That is the end of my show. End of our discussion. I put this one up here just to sort of pique questions maybe. You should see some elements that you recognize there, maybe a couple that you don't. But I'd like to go ahead and entertain questions at this time.
We'll use the microphone. First off, big thank you to Michael.
Thank you. A friend of mine who's a Hopi was looking at these petroglyphs, and he said there's a local dialect aspect to this, that they're not all the same across the region. Is that correct?
That is true.
Okay, thank you.
That is true. Remember how in my presentation, I discussed distinctions among clans, not just symbols, but the ceremonies that they're responsible for? They're unique to the clan.
Michael, my question is, I noticed an absence of fish in the symbols. Is that a reason for that?
Yes, there's a reason for that. We don't have very good archaeological evidence that they used fish. There are a few, I understand, in the Phoenix Basin, which would make sense because at times the Salt River there flowed and the Verde River actually wasn't dammed, and you had better runs of desert fishes like the Colorado River pike minnow, humpback chubs, things like that would migrate through. And I'm guessing, I'm inferring that they used that resource when it was available, but we don't see them portrayed very often. So I'm guessing it was a secondary food source at best.
I was wondering about the status of making the salt mine into a state park. I have heard rumors about that for a few years.
I'm unaware of that, and I would be surprised if it happened because it's mostly Forest Service land. The Prescott National Forest manages that piece of property. Now, adjacent to it, I think, is state land. That would make some more sense. A bigger question, and one that the elders posed when we were on site, is can we have our stuff back? And I thought, that's a really good question, because it isn't ours. It's in the Arizona State Museum, very limited access. Now, for those that would like to see examples of what I mentioned, in the Verde Ranger District office in Camp Verde, you know where that is? So there is an exhibit there that has artifacts from the salt mine, including sandals, a rock pick, torches, because they're dark, they're tunnels, right? So they built torches to go in there and mine the salt, and they have examples of those in that.
Is there any reason there weren't any chickens?
They did not have domesticated chickens. They did have turkeys. We might have a turkey petroglyph. Little tough to tell, and usually the ones I shared with you, I feel confident in my assessment of what that element represents. If I took a bunch out and didn't include others because they're either not very representative or they're not clear enough to make the case. So I left those things out. But so in terms of fowl, we know they had domesticated turkeys. And we're pretty sure, based on our excavated context, that they did not have chickens. Some are represented, rarely though, in petroglyphs, and none of the examples that I'm confident show a turkey. This one right here and this one right here are horned lizards, which we know is the water clan symbol, right? Remember? Horned lizard, water clan from the what used to be V-Bar-V, now it's Crane Petroglyph site. The water clan symbols were prominent on the solar panel. We have the Sand Clan here. And up here, Sand Clan. I'd like to focus your attention for a moment. What's going on right here? So we talked about hunt magic, right? Hunting magic, what the process you'd go through before you harvested an animal. There were other prayers for animal fertility. They're making more animals on that panel. It's a prayer for animal animal fertility. That's what it is.
So I have a question. To what degree do we need to be careful not to assume concurrence when we see a panel? It's like we're kind of thinking these are all related. Is it possible that some were created generations after others on the same rock surface?
Absolutely. We talked a little bit about that at one of the sites early on, where we had some charcoal renderings below some other renderings, and I hope I said that those came later. One of them was mounted on a horse, so we know that came later. And we had another panel, the one at the spring, where I showed there's an earlier concentric circle element surrounded by a newer element that I thought suggested might be a map for hunting. So we're not assuming they're all contemporary. These are, especially when you see multiple clan signs on the same panel, those usually refer to, remember, one of the purposes of a clan symbol is to document somebody completing a pilgrimage or visiting a site or something like that. And I think that's what you see with the repetition here. We know that's the case. I think it's called the Willow Creek site, which is on the trail for the salt pilgrimage from the Hopi Mesas. There are some of those clan symbols, there are hundreds of them in a row. And it's from successive years of making that pilgrimage by clan members.
There's a very interesting site in Utah where there's these creatures that are about this tall. And they're all this way. And then there's other petroglyphs coming up this way. So obviously those were made and then the rock rolled.
Rock rolled over.
I find that fascinating, but it's also a reminder that because they're together doesn't necessarily mean
They're contemporary. That's true.
I think there's one more question in the back, and then I think Michael will stay a little later if you have any other lingering questions. Do you have a hand up?
So the BRV site,
It's called Crane Petroglyph Site
that's
now.
the way they call it, Crane Petroglyph site. So there was a reinterpretation of that not too long ago where they thought that people had come back and superimposed solar calendar on top of older images. Is there more research on that, do you know?
Not that I'm aware of, and I would not offhand dispute that notion, but we know that the solar elements on that panel are pre-contact. We know that. They were there, that used to be private property, and then that ranch was deeded to the Coconino National Forest, and so that family that deeded the property, they operated that as a ranch for a very long time, and they had pictures from when they first showed up. All that's there. The biggest change that I know for sure that's happened is wear on some of the panels, because they graze livestock and the cows like to rub on rocks, and so we lost some clarity with some of that. But otherwise, they're very well preserved, remarkably so.
Well, let's give another big hand to Michael, and thank you all for joining us tonight.